Hi there, my name is Chris O'Brien from RunTeach, and in this video I just want to go over energy systems and how they apply to your running and to your training. Now, talking about running systems is okay, but visually I find them quite hard in terms of representation. So we're going to use a few different graphics that shows just slightly different ways of looking at the energy systems, and then we'll talk about how that works with your training. So this first one is from UK Athletics. And it's from my coaching course 10-15 years ago, and it's quite a nice overview of just to see the three energy systems, or the primary energy systems. First of all, we have the aerobic system here, and then we have the lactic system, what we used to call the anaerobic system, and then we have alactic system, or the phosphocreatine system. Across the top they have time, and that represents how long an energy system lasts in terms of giving primary energy. So if we just start with the alactic system. So the alactic system is, if you were doing all out 10-second sprints, maximum velocity, then you'd be predominantly in this alactic system. It's a very fast combustible burst of energy using phosphocreatine as a fuel, so it doesn't need oxygen, doesn't need glucose, doesn't need fat. But it burns out very quickly because it's an internal fuel source. And it takes a little while to recharge as well. So if you were doing these 10-second sprint efforts at maximum velocity, you'd have to give quite a bit of time for between each effort so that this system recharges. Otherwise you end up training in a different system. We then have the lactic system, or the anaerobic system. Now UK Athletics talk about this as being a linking energy system, linking between alactic and aerobic. We will look into that a little bit more. It's a little bit more complex than that. So we have the lactic system that produces lactate, and it produces an acid, and we could say it's lactic acid, but actually lactic acid only forms for a very small amount of time, fraction of a second, then it splits off into lactate, which we can actually use as a fuel. But the acidic part does build up. Hydrogen ions do build up, and we're working at a rate where the oxygen can't really get round to those cells, so it can't remove the stuff from the cells. And that's why we get this build-up. So it doesn't use oxygen, but it does need a fuel source, which is a glucose fuel source, which is our stored version of glucose, which is called glycogen, and that's held within your muscle cells. We then have the aerobic system, and the aerobic system is our sustained energy system that can last us all day. That's the system we're sitting in right now. It's a system we actually run most of our races in, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. It needs oxygen, and it needs fuel sources from food and drink, so stored version of glucose with glycogen, and also can burn on fat as well. So let's have a look at it in a slightly different way. This graphic, just going back to the previous one, actually they talk about the lactic system being kind of around about 3 minutes worth of time. This particular graphic from Metrofit kind of disagrees a little bit with that, in the sense that they say this anaerobic system, the lactic system, is 10 to 60 seconds. It's probably somewhere in between is the reality. So this shows it in terms of the total percentage of energy given to you when you are doing a hard effort. So let's just say you go out, you're doing 5k park run or a 5k race, 10k race, and you go out way too hard at the beginning. This is what it's saying. The first 10 seconds is predominantly going to be in that phosphocreatine alactic system. That'll then burn out, and then you'll continue trying to work as hard as you can, but the effort's going to drop because it doesn't produce energy in the same way. And for the next sort of 60 seconds, perhaps 2-3 minutes, you're then working in this anaerobic, lactic, or they call glycolytic system, because that's one of the processes behind it, before you then drop down into the aerobic system. So it's quite a nice representation of the effort that you where the energy is coming from, which system it's coming from when you go out at a hard effort. And we'll see another representation of this in this graphic here. And we see in this graphic here that we have, this is one I created because I think it represents it in terms of effort. So we have the effort level going up here, we have time going on the bottom, and then we have our energy systems. So let's say you go out for your 5k race, you get over that first hurdle, the first hurdle of going out the gate too fast, not literally a hurdle. That would add an extra little bit of challenge to parkrun. But you've got, so you start to settle down, so you're working predominantly in this aerobic zone. And you're probably working quite high up in this aerobic zone if you're doing a hard 5k effort. Okay, so we're now at what we call LT1. LT1 is lactate threshold 1. It's the kind of first point at which your oxygen can't quite keep up with the demands of the cells. So the lactate is starting to be produced a little more than it can be cleared and reused as fuel. And you've got the hydrogen ions being built up, so that's creating this acidic environment. Then if you were to continue pushing the effort up, so let's just say, okay, you're going to overtake somebody and you keep that overtaking effort up, you start to push through the threshold zone and you get to this LT2, lactate threshold 2. And that's pretty much the point of no return. This is now you're going into anaerobic. So you're no longer using oxygen because it can't get round to the cells quick enough to be able to keep up with demand, which also means that the lactate is building up now quite quickly and the hydrogen ions are building up quite quickly. They can't be taken out of the cell, so the cells start to become less efficient, and that's where we get this sort of 60 seconds to 3 minutes where you can only last in this zone. Now let's just say you're overtaking and you continue pushing your absolute maximum and you dip into this alactic zone, which really you're not going to be in there for very long before you come down. Because if you spent all the energy here, when you come crashing down, quite often you come right back down into this aerobic zone. So it's quite a good illustration of showing you as you put effort in at certain points of your race. So you hit a hill, for example, and you're going to be going up through these zones. So this is why pacing is really important. Now, for most of your races, 5k, 10k, you're going to be up here at the top of this aerobic zone, dipping into this threshold zone. For half marathons, you're going to be similar-ish. If you are racing it, you're going to be top of the aerobic zone. Marathons, arguably, you are as well. And you might be dipping into there depending on the terrain, depending on, the longer you go staying higher up in an energy system, the more fatigue, because you're asking your system, unless you're really well trained, you're asking your system to carry on at the level it's at, which can be quite hard if you're not a well-trained athlete. So if your heart is not well trained to pump volume of blood or blood round enough to get to your working muscles, then actually, even if you're working at the top of here, over time, it's got the same effect as hitting, LT1, LT2. VO2 max, kind of similar type of point to LT2. VO2 max is the maximum volume of oxygen you can take in, really before you go anaerobic. So it's that kind of same point. Now, if you were training for a ultramarathon, or running an ultramarathon, then predominantly you're going to be in this aerobic zone, and you might go up into these other zones, probably not ever really into the red, but you're going up to the threshold, potentially lactic if depending on the terrain. It'll be a terrain thing or a time thing. So if you're doing a 100k and it's taking you several hours to do that and it's reasonably hard terrain, over time you will be going up into these zones as fatigue kicks in. And you can manage that with your fueling, you can manage that with your breathing, and obviously all the training you did before you did the event, of course. So why is this important? Well, I think it's important to train across all of these zones, no matter what distance you're training for. Because if you train in the alactic zone, then in theory, you're pulling up these two zones. So you're creating more room for your aerobic base. Same with working in your lactic system, you're pulling everything up a little bit. You're pushing that alactic system further away from you. You're training in the threshold zone between LT1 and LT2, you're doing the same thing. You're widening that threshold zone and you're training your system to buffer lactate and use it as a fuel much more efficiently, so you can stay in this zone. You're increasing your tolerance to carbon dioxide, one of the chemical substances that makes you want to breathe heavily. So a lot of the breathing stuff that I do with people is about helping them create a higher tolerance to carbon dioxide, so you can stay in this zone for longer. So when you're racing 5k and 10k, you're in this threshold zone, you can stay it for longer. That's what you want to do. And the net effect of all of this is your aerobic zone moves up. So let's just say, for example, you're a runner who's currently doing a 9-minute mile pace. By training all it in, you can end up with an 8-minute mile pace, because you get this faster pace for less, for the same amount of effort, because all of this zone has all moved up all up a notch with your training. So you've got to train across all of these different zones. Most of us are pretty good at training in this green zone, but we're not really that great at training in some of the other zones. The important thing about if you do that, if you are training these zones, is you've got to remember that you need to give the zone, the energy system, enough time to recover. So if you're purely training in alactic, so you're doing maximum velocity sprints, 8 to 10 second sprints, or you're doing hill sprints, so you're in this zone for that time, that system needs to recharge. So if you're not having between 2 and 5 minutes, perhaps even longer, of recovery between your efforts, you're probably not giving it enough time to recharge. So the next effort you do, you're actually only down here. Okay, so you're training in this zone, not this zone. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're structuring your training, that you need to structure the training around what you want to achieve. If you're achieving threshold zone, you don't want massive long recoveries in between, because you want to force yourself to get into this zone and stay in this zone. So they might be 3 minute or 3 to 10 minute interval lengths, with maybe a 1 or 2 minute, 3 minute recovery, and that'll keep you at the top of the aerobic or in this zone here. Some of the best marathon training that I've ever done is exactly that. You go and do a 24-minute effort, then you do 5 times 2 minutes all up here, all quite short recoveries, and it's forcing you to be up here, and then you do another 20 minutes afterwards, aiming to be a little bit faster than the first 20. So you're kind of working all around this zone here, which is ultimately where you want to race at. So it's really good for helping to push everything back up. Now, if we look at ultramarathons, the longer period of time you go on, sometimes it can feel like you're going into these zones, because fatigue gets in. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not a well-trained athlete, other conditions such as long COVID, for example, there are certain forms of long COVID where it denatures the cells, so it changes or damages even the cells. The mitochondria, which is the respiratory part of the cells, responsible for that energy. And if that isn't working efficiently over time, naturally you can creep up to here. And I experienced exactly that. I've had long COVID symptoms for over 3.5 years at this particular point. And where it gets me, particularly in the marathon, as I got to 38K in the marathons, that's like mile 23, and everything was great. It was a really good race. I was bang on target of where I wanted to be. But what happened over time is that it felt like I just hit LT2 at that particular point. I was well fueled, my breathing's really good, so there's no problem with any of that. I basically effectively hit the wall at this point, because your muscle cells can no longer work, because there's been a very gradual leakage, if you like, of this buildup of lactate, and because the mitochondria aren't working properly in the cells, the cells can't clear down, so effectively it can't uptake some of the fuel being oxygen and also glucose. So over time, that particular effort working up here, it was just too much, and up into LT2, and that last 5K, the last 3 miles was, it was like walking through molasses. It was just the worst I've ever had, and across any of the marathons that I've done. It just went from being absolutely fine 1 second to not being fine, so effectively hitting the wall, but being well fueled. So it just didn't really make a lot of sense in that perspective point. So the big lesson from here is train across all energy systems for best results. Okay, really important to do that, really help your training. We have to look at energy in terms of fueling, the calories, the energy we get from the fuel, the food we eat, and the hydration, the drinks that we're having. But we also have to think about it in terms of oxygen. As we've just seen, oxygen is really, really important for your muscles to function well, particularly in the aerobic zone, which is where most of our racing takes place. And yes, we do dip in and dip out, depending on what we're doing, but we need to be, breathing really, really well. And I'm just going to leave you again with this graphic, just so you can see those energy zones like that. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, then please subscribe, please share it with people, let people know, and I will see you next time.